Because it was interesting because you mentioned Cook, Peter Cook. He's obviously he's with Archigram. He's kind of on the other end of the scale. But I went to a talk of his, and he said something really interesting. Going back to what we were saying, actually going on to something that I spoke to Sat Winder about, which was about this idea of the fear of failure or the fear of making mistakes, which kind of grips sometimes students and just creatives in general. And something which really helped me is I went to a talk with Peter Cooks, and he said you should have 2 phases in your design. Phase 1 should be your creativity phase, where you just create and you don't critique, you just create. And then phase 2 is your critique. And you keep going between the two, you keep bouncing backward and forward, but when you're creating, don't critique. And that was quite profound, because I remember as a student, one of the things that constantly gets you is you're sitting there drawing, and you've got someone right there doing an amazing drawing or a plan or a section, and every line you put down is, you're overthinking everything. So that was quite interesting. I wonder what you think about that.
I think there's a lot in that. I mean, I think, having taught students in first year and final year at architecture school for best part of 20 years, I'm seeing the full gamut of ability. And the thing that stays the same is that kind of racked with kind of self-doubt. Am I doing the right thing? Is this the best use of my time? And by that point, you get into paralysis. By that point, you can't actually move forward. And that's the kind of greatest killer of productivity. And actually, sort of, in a sense, that's why years ago, apart from anything to try and build the identity of the dual architecture landscape cohort, I sort of derived the charrette. The charrette's a thing that's been going for as long as architecture, really, and the idea of a quick, rough, ready workshop. And I think, that sense of the charrette was designed to sort of help students understand that you can work as a kind of team. You can work rough and dirty and ready, and you can generate quick, amazing ideas. It won't have the refined design, it might not have the refined thinking, but the quality of those ideas, because they're quick, because they're instinctive, because the time limitation, you go and see a problem on day 1 and you have to resolve it on day 2. You've got maybe 6 hours in which to come up with a whole scheme to design a whole part of the city. You haven't got time to worry. And actually taking that process then back into your studio work. And also, I think this is a crucial thing in architecture schools. We train you all as individual geniuses, but actually, when you get into work, unless you're a sole trader, it's so rare that you work on your own. And so actually the idea of a team of people working towards making something is a much richer kind of environment.
And you can have one person who's excellent at computer modelling, one person who's excellent at model making, one person who's excellent at drawing, and work in a team.
And if everybody in the team can do everything equally well, then actually I think that sometimes is as problematic as anyway. So, I think you're right, you do want the professional teams to be well-rounded, you do want them to, but I think that's also where the dual program is really important, in terms of it gives people skills to be able to talk across profession. I think, the ability to understand how landscape architects talk about landscape, how architects talk about architecture, to be able to sit as this interdisciplinary liaison is really unique to the course, and it's really important, but it also highlights a sort of bigger shame of the wider profession, that, in those moments of kind of paralysis, reach out, discuss, talk. Don't sit there going, where's this line go? Don't see other people as necessarily a rival, but actually collaborate. And I think that's kind of, again, one of the things with the charrette, where it's really, really super important. It's the reason that you can come up with a solution in 6 hours to something is because you're not working as one person, you're working as one of 12. And all of a sudden everybody can go off and, right, these are my skills, and you find value, you find people's voices, you see first years talking at the heart of the team right next to final years. Could you imagine when you came in first year working with a final year? And that's so intimidating. It's like, oh my God, but their drawings and their language, and actually reduce it down, distill it into kind of a broad inter-year workshop. and you get everyone talking to each other as equals. Maybe somebody has a bit more experience and says, oh, try doing this drawing, or try making that, or, but actually that generosity of an idea is really important.
I love how you talk about that, and I wonder, like, you obviously you tutor at Sheffield. I've started doing sort of part-time tutoring with the film and storytelling with Khizr Studio. But one thing I've realised is that a good tutor, and from my time at uni, I remember this, a good tutor is one, not necessarily that's a brilliant architect, but someone who instills confidence in you in a way. So I remember with you, for instance, in our final year, you were my tutor, and one thing you were very good at is getting to the nub of the idea of this project. You'd have this crazy student come in with, I want to do this on the facade, and I want to do this on the urban scale, and I've got an idea for a 1 to 50 like model. But actually, it was important to get to what is the core of the issue, what is a core idea. And do you think, so talking about kind of design doubt or that paralysis in the design process, do you think what maybe it's Peter Cook's idea of, you create and then you critique, but how do we instill more confidence in students? Because I found that the students that really take away a lot are the ones that you go to and you go, that's a fantastic idea. Why are you why are you doing this? Oh, someone told me to do this, or some other. But no, that's a great idea. Focus on that idea. How do you see that? How do we instill that kind of confidence in designers? I remember also, just to add, I remember seeing, some of the most amazing student work I've ever seen, when I was studying here, and I'd go to the crit, and the work is like, it's going to be incredible, like their final grade or whatever it is. And then when they go to present, they would almost run out crying, because of the pressure of, will someone say something bad? But why? But the thing I wonder is, why have we made it such a bad thing? And I think my belief is, with the school system, you've got about 10 years where you've got only one right answer, where you're trained that there's only one right answer. And then when you come to architecture school, where suddenly almost everything is dependent on taste and subjectivity, you are under this pressure of what's the right answer, that person's doing that thing, that's the right answer, no, that's the right answer, no, my tutor said this, so this is so it's almost like we need to detrain people to think like that in a binary way.
I think, again, it's the strength of the dual program. They will have a tutorial in architecture, and the architecture tutor will go, and by the way, you're a dual student, and what do you think about this as an idea for landscape? And that question of what do you think about this as an idea gets translated to, my tutor told me to do this. So then you go downstairs into landscape, and landscape go, bloody architects, they don't know what they're doing in a landscape. What are you doing? Oh, and by the way, what do you think about doing this with the building? And go back upstairs. Oh, my landscape tutor told me this to do this with. And actually, it's about, I think, a huge part of good communication is about being a good listener. And I think that's critical, and I think that comes back to the idea of story. I think it comes back to, your central kind of idea of storytelling and narrative. Long before we drew and wrote things down, actually the human psyche is built around the story and passing on knowledge through verbal communication. And I think it's that in architecture school we have a really sort of limited taxonomy about how we communicate space. And it's through a plan and a section and an elevation. And I think particularly if you're working in the residential sector and profession, well, actually, no, I think across the built environment, lay people don't understand the plan and the section. So actually, we've codified architecture into a way that only a limited audience can communicate with. And I think that kind of idea that you as you said, you go to school, 10 years, of course there's an answer to everything, except for maybe if you do art or photography or whatever it is. And then in architecture school, you're right. No, there's no one way to do this. And that's part of the joy of teaching. I taught first year for 10 years, and so we would set 140 students, essentially the same project on the same site, and you would have 140 entirely different projects. That's the beauty, but that's also the trauma. It's like you're looking over, as you keep saying, you look over your shoulder at what Joe Bloggs is doing next door to you, and you're like, oh my God, that's a beautiful drawing. And I come back to the idea, the central kind of part of our conversation really. It's actually, I quite often as a tutor will divorce the quality of the drawing, the quality of visual communication with the quality of an idea and the idea of a story behind a project. And by that, and I think as students you don't realise that, or you don't trust that, because you always look at the person who's top in the year and you go, oh my God, they did this model and they did that drawing, and they can draw by hand and they can paint and they can do lino cuts and they can make models, and you're just like, oh, you're sick. I couldn't do that, I was never that person. And I think, maybe as a teacher that you remember that yourself, and so I try actively to discourage people to do that. And I think that's really important. Stop looking over your shoulder. What are you doing? What's your idea? What are you trying to communicate about your project? And come back to sort of something you said earlier, that don't try and pour every idea that you've ever had into one project. No, have a kind of core strategy. And I think that ties back to what we do in wider practice. Actually, you can survive budget cuts. And I've worked on a project, it was kind of public sports pavilion in Sheffield, and the budget kind of pressures on that. We got to kind of 3/4 of the way through the build, and all of a sudden funding changed in the project. You had this massive swipe and this huge cut in the project. You still had to deliver. And the building, I think, stands as well as the original competition scheme as the final project, because we remembered as really strong story. We just had this idea of the traditional sports pavilion, these two interlocking boxes. So when we had to run through it with the kind of funding cuts, the end building didn't really suffer because we had this idea of a story which we could tell about that building. So as we were cutting, we were like, well, how does that measure against our narrative? That narrative changed through the project. So in a way, it's a bit like you were alluding to with Pete Cook. It's like you generate an idea, you have fun, you throw it all on a page, and then you edit it, and then you have fun, and then that's architecture. And I think that's also architectural education. I think when you're 18, 19, 20, 21, that's very hard to put into context, having had 10 years of school where everything has a right answer. To say, no, it's okay that your project will shift and change, and to believe that the people in your review session will understand that this project is a moving feast, because you're never going to realise it, you're never going to build it.
Well, I think absolutely, you're absolutely right, and I think that was my, in undergrad, that's what used to get me a lot of the time, because you'd have like 10 weeks to do a project, and 4 weeks in you think, right, I've got this idea, I know what I'm doing, and then all of a sudden it was like, wait a minute, is this the right answer? But that person's doing this. Oh, I should have thought about it like that. Yeah. And instead of seeing your idea through, and instead of me seeing my idea through, it was a case of constantly worrying about, am I doing the right thing? It took me a long time to kind of train myself out that way of thinking. But you're absolutely right.
I think that's also a really strategic difference between the traditional architectural crit and perhaps what we do at Sheffield, which is the review. And I know some people laugh at the difference between a review and a crit, but I genuinely buy into the idea that actually a review it's student-led, it's discursive, it's there to encourage discussion, so that you're not waiting for some person at the back of the room to go, I decree this is right, or I decree that is wrong. It's actually, no, what's this project about, and how can we make this better, and how can we sort of take that element and maybe push it there? And because that's then student-led, and what we tend to find is that, students will have a really innate ability to read their friends or other people's projects. And hopefully the penny drops then by the fact that they've then been encouraged to talk in a formal setting about somebody else's work. The penny will drop on their own work and help them to say, well, actually, no, I don't need to do all of these things. I can focus on this because I've just sat all day and listened to people being told, well, yeah, do this or do that. And, that I think it's more encouraging environment than a sort of punitive environment of the traditional crit. I remember times in my education where people were made to cry in crits in the traditional crit setting. Gosh. I can't countenance that. That's not my place to make somebody cry. My place is there to nurture and support and encourage them to make the best of their story and their ideas. That's set against also my passion for the architecture and the landscape, and there's always to get people to think outside the red line of their site.
Well, and I think from my own personal experience, the one thing you were good at, it was not making one of many, but not making people cry, shall we say? That was one thing you were good at. It was always constructive meeting, constructive criticism, and that's a tricky thing actually. And I want to kind of get your thoughts on this. Like, how do you manage to give advice to students without them taking it personally? Because obviously everyone is different, but some people will get sort of defensive. And I remember even at master's level, there was a certain lack of independence. And I was the same at undergrad, where whatever the tutor said is like, you really cared about, and that's how the project almost had to be. But when you got to at master's level, it almost became a bit less so, at least for me, where I was a bit more confident in my ideas. And I was like, if I show a tutor this, and they come up with something, I should feel comfortable enough to reject it, whether that be a landscape tutor or whoever else, because the tutor is just trying to give you ideas, but it's up to you to filter those ideas. But it's tricky because some people I've tutored, they do that, they hang on to that, and they think, oh, that's how I have to do it. And if I don't, I've got it wrong, and I don't want to get it wrong. And if I get it wrong, then I'm not a smart person. I'm not intelligent. It goes so, they take it into such a deep level, and I know because I've been there. But your approach is quite refined in this respect. So how do you? I don't know if you can talk about this, but how do you do it where you don't offend, but you actually, the student ends up leaving with something? And maybe you've got examples of where that you have offended or something, but my experience has been that you're usually quite good with this.
Oh, usually I find out years afterwards that I said something that somebody remembers, and I'm like, God, did I say that?
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I think it's...
you can't win then, I suppose. It's...
No, I think what that stands to me is, that when I first heard that, I was really discomforted by it. I was like, oh, God, and it makes you second guess everything you say in a kind of tutorial setting. But actually, if I thought that at every setting, I wouldn't teach, I wouldn't be able to. And I think the general essence for me is I love teaching. So it's really, I'm here to help people make the best of their time here. And so I'm not here to berate anybody. I'm here to sort of take what I know from practice, being a practicing architect. I'm here to share my passion about architecture and landscape, being this holistic entity, and to try and help people achieve their best. So why would I go in and go, well, that's rubbish and that's rubbish? And, that's not my job. My job is to succinctly look at a piece of work and find what I would think is the most useful and best way forward. So it's actually about nurturing, and I think really, whether I'm teaching at UG or whether I'm teaching at Masters, it's about being excited about a project. You think, Christ, some students have invested 5-6 months in a project. How could I not be passionate for them?
I completely agree, and it comes back to that idea of if you can communicate your thoughts on a student's project, but in a way that motivates them, in a way that gives them confidence, then usually I find they're quite accepting of that.
Yeah.
And also it's worth, and sometimes I'll also say things like, if I've misunderstood this, or if you have any other right, because obviously, like you say, they've done the project for 6 months and suddenly you come in, you might not have the full picture, or at least I might not have the full picture. So I do also say, if this is incorrect, feel free to completely tell me this is wrong, because it's always like you want to train them to think that, well, this isn't, what you say isn't the be all and end all. Obviously you've got way more experience than I do in this, but as a student, I remember, sometimes you just think what the tutor says is the golden thing. And
I think that comes back to your point about paralysis earlier. Is there a right answer or not? But I think also that it comes back again to why the dual course and dual students are really well versed in listening and praising something that's said to them, because weekly they get contradictory information, sometimes contradictory information. So they have to work out how to prioritise at a way earlier position in their career than anybody else in architecture.
Well, and even if it's not contradictory, it's the scope of landscape is almost different to architecture. Yeah. So you're forced to immediately start thinking about it from an urban level.
But also time, there's that lovely diagram of building and landscape at 50 years. At 50 years, the building's from day one, the building looks amazing. By 50 years, you're like, geez, this needs a lick of paint, probably needs new windows. It's all refurb. Day one, the landscape, it's all right. By 50 years in, you've got the trees and they're maturing and all the shrubs and the plants are kind of looking great. And, this kind of inverse time scale. So I think time, seasonality, the way that you think about a landscape, you never really think about with architecture. And I wonder whether with kind of climate change, whether actually we're going to have to think about buildings differently. What's this building? How does it operate in a really severe wet winter downpour where the rainfall is heavier because the temperatures are higher, so therefore the clouds carrying more water. So we get a deluge rather than the kind of traditional British winter rain shower, versus the summer where actually we get periodic heat waves and you're dealing with temperatures in 30 plus. And that building has to sit there. So actually kind of the seasonal change of buildings, the adaptability of buildings.
Well, absolutely. It's that the temporal aspect of landscape is something that is so unique to a landscape education. And it's something that, I didn't experience myself in the architectural side of things. Yeah. So like you say, you're not only thinking in terms of physical scale, but you're thinking in terms of time scale. Yeah. One of the things I try and when I speak to practices, we'll talk about the idea of the place, the landscape in which a building sits, the place in which it's being held is as important in our perception of the quality of the architecture as is the actual quality of the architecture. When you approach a building, when you walk into a building, you've first got to go through whether it's public realm, whether it's street, whether it's landscape to get there. So, with some of the storytelling at Khizr Studio, there's a huge emphasis on context, a huge emphasis on landscape. All of that has come through this course, through the dual course. But there's a film we did, there's a piece of storytelling we did for a practice in Hebden Bridge, and the first, this was in Sheffield, and the first almost third of the film is nothing to do with the architecture. It's completely placing you in the space, in the landscape context, in the geographical context. And the beautiful thing about landscape, actually, we can maybe talk about this, is we were talking earlier about the poetry and humanizing a space. And that's something that landscape can do, can complement when it comes to a piece of architecture, is it can completely humanize and give us a more sensory experience and a more sensory atmosphere. What do you think?
I think that's entirely right. But then maybe that's kind of my practice approach to architecture. It's all about kind of sense of place. It's all about sense of material. It's all about that kind of the human scale. And it's sort of one of the things that I really love about, again, sort of picking up on the theme you were talking about earlier. Well, it's all very well to think about a domestic scale, but what's it at a big scale? And I remember reading about the British Library when it first opened and Sandy Wilson, and I was really lucky. The guy who I sort of did my first year in practice with, the guy who sat next to me, he spent 20 years of his life designing the reading desks for the humanities room. And each of the library spaces was given a character. It was this enormous building, but it was always about the human interface. And you get that from the minute you walk into this sort of quadruple height atrium and you touch the handrail, and it's got this alto-esque leather handrail with a brass kind of junctioning piece, and you're like, this building is all about the person. And you've got Prince Charles at the time saying, oh, it's a secret police headquarters. It's like completely failed to understand that actually the experience of using this thing, the choice of using brick as a flooring material, meant that everything was down to a kind of unique individual human scale. And you go into that building now, and it is so rich a space. It's one of the best spaces in London because it understands us as a person within a civic building. And you know, I think that gets a little bit away from the impact of time and season, but actually I think that building was designed to last. You know, it's got 100 plus years in it, whereas a lot of buildings we design now are kind of 50 years. And it comes back to our economic discussion earlier, you know, the throwaway nature of architecture. Well, actually, I think we're going to have to get back to, with climate crisis, an architecture of 100 years plus, you know, and how do we change that culturally? And with that building that sits there for 100 years, we've got to then think about place and how landscape becomes part of that story as much as the building does.
Well, you used a really interesting line when we spoke earlier, and you said, I think you said pardon me, you said something along the lines of a landscape of architecture. And it's almost like, and I don't know if this is what you meant by it, but it's almost as if space is something which, whether it's defined by a hard boundary or a soft boundary, spatial experiences where, as designers, or you, at least you, begin when you design something, you look at, well, forget about if this bit of space is being enclosed by shrubbery or whether it's being enclosed by a wall, but what is the quality of that space? And then starting to eventually wrap and clothe that space in whatever material it might be. And the building you just mentioned about this, you know, huge kind of space, but then you've got this kind of intimate moment. It's really interesting, and this is a bit of a side point, but what I found so natural about the transition into what I do now is all of the principles we learned, especially on the landscape urban design side of the dual course, the idea of a patterns of language, you know, studying how humans behave, looking at the idea of a city having expanding and contracting spaces to create a certain sense of dynamism, and all of those principles, when you look at storytelling, they feed in so naturally. So, for instance, I think one of the most successful things about the work that we do is that a piece of storytelling will sit at different layers. It will have a layer of the urban, but then it will have a layer of the human, and it's constantly playing between that. And maybe there's a shot which lingers, almost like inviting you to read into it, like a painting. You know, you might stand and read a painting, and you've got this huge kind of, and maybe that's in a kind of relative sense with that building, it's that huge atrium. You've got a shot which lingers. It's like giving you that space. And then you've got, maybe you're cutting into the more intimate scale of how a father and a son might be using that space. And all of a sudden you brought it down, and you've got these more dynamic moments happening. It's really interesting to me, this is, again, it's a bit of a side point, but it's really interesting to me how all of these principles that we learn, and this is why I say I realized that architecture school was a storytelling course for me, because all of the conversations we would have, you and I would have, were based around, okay, great, you've done this 1 to 500 scale master plan. What is it like to be there? You know, what is it like to be here? And forcing again to go down to that level, or maybe it's the other way around. And so with film, it's the same thing. It's about, and all of those lessons, you know, it's amazing because it's kind of like it's come all the way into what I do now. And I pride the work on the fact that it's not like I've gone through 5 years of architecture school, 7 years including the years out, and then I've, you know, I see it as a complete continuation, and I see it as almost like an extension to my master's project. And I'm constantly critiquing the work in the same manner, exactly the same manner. Is this, what's the poetic dimension of this? What is the technical dimension of this? Will someone who's a non-architect understand this? Are we expressing the temporality of a landscape? Are we expressing the hard material, the soft material? All of that stuff. And the films are, you know, they're just something that, they just become something so special because all of that know-how has gone into it, you know, from a landscape architecture level to an architecture level. All of that know-how has gone into it.
And I think part of that for me is about not being afraid of scale. Quite often I think that sort of notion of familiarity with something that you work on a lot, whereas with dual programming, with that dual education, you're always in, out. You're always thinking about, right, the door threshold, how am I getting to this landscape at an urban level, and then coming back, and that ducking and diving between scale, that ducking and diving between, as we said, seasonality, time. That's a very rare course. That's a very rare pattern of study, that you're looking at all of these things holistically. And I think is the strengths of the course. And I think whether or not you sort of pursue that duality into the urban environment profession, into the construction industry, or whether you take it in a tangent like you have. I know so many folk who have actually not gone on to do architecture or landscape, and they actually take those skills. One of my closest colleagues left architecture for a few years and set up making cakes, the most beautiful cakes, and her briefing process was identical to how you would brief for a building. And then the cakes were so beautifully architectural, but every single one told a story of the people that wanted it. So I think that kind of notion of kind of translation of ideas and story is what gives us our strength.
Yeah, it's almost training you in a certain way to think, to think in a certain way, and that can be adopted into, you can go into writing, architecture, whatever it might be, cakes, but it shows that the strength is really how to think in a way, and like you said earlier, there's some students play it safe, and they'll there's absolutely nothing wrong with this, but I always found that the students who played it really safe and were going for the firsts and got the firsts and did great academically, a lot of the time they were ticking what needed to be done, and sometimes and I'm not just saying this because I didn't get first, but because some people who got first were incredible. But no, some people who got first were incredible. But I remember seeing at the end of year shows, a large, and not just in this school of architecture, but in many, that a large part of the projects were very, very safe, and it felt like a bit, to me, a waste, because you're in this place where you can actually test ideas and fail and make mistakes and learn, and you're not punished for that. I mean, not in a way you would be in a practice, and you can try out different things. And I feel like when you approach architectural education with that kind of playfulness, you can make more of your time in practice. What do you think?
I completely agree, and I completely know I didn't do that. I was too straight-laced. I came and I delivered a very competent project, or a series of projects all the way through. I think actually the transition for me was twofold. One was between second year and third year, and I went and decided not to work in an architectural practice. I think I was a postie. Drove around North London in my postman for Royal Mail, and actually seeing people's lives in a totally different way. When I then came back to architecture school for third year, I was almost more hungry to do architecture. I almost wanted to do it more, and so actually I was a bit more liberated. I was a bit more kind of free thinking. Probably the buildings that I designed they were good, they were competent, but you'd never go back and do anything that you'd never build anything you did in first or second.
Of course, yeah.
So.
And competency is incredibly important.
It is
incredibly important.
And then I came back fifth year and I did the most terrifying studio I could, just to shake my malaise, because after a year in practice where you'd just been delivering mass housing, it was like, well, why the hell am I at architecture school? What is all this kind of theoretical pontificating if that's what practice is? And I think, so fifth year I deliberately chose the hardest studio I could to shake me out of that. And I didn't do great. I think actually I completely wasted that time in that year. Believe me, I had a great fun time, but the project was awful. And I completely agree with every bit of criticism that I ever got on that.
Do you feel like you learned from it?
Oh God, yeah, entirely.
So it wasn't a waste then in that sense?
Oh no, absolutely. And that's, I think, the point is, I took the risk to do a really difficult studio and I didn't thrive in it. But by the time I hit 6th year, I had the confidence to react to that kind of sense of failure. And I think that kind of brings us around to how I teach and why I teach. I react against some of the teaching that I had in that period. I fully embrace other parts of what that teaching was trying to do. It was really strategically important. It took me years to work out what that teaching did. But also I know what my teaching was in 6th year. It was taught with kindness, it was taught with compassion, and I think that's fundamental. And I think, that comes back to this idea of us as storytellers, as providers of narrative to people's existence in many ways. Sounds very grandiose, doesn't it? But, whether it's an office or a school or a house, again, I come back to what's that human, it's a humanist kind of approach to things. It's what do we do for people? And if we're going to waste carbon making buildings, surely we make those buildings beautiful and they're going to last a long time. And that kind of ties us back to that post-war austerity, that actually there's this time of mass kind of social scarring, height of economic poverty, and yet we produced beautiful places in reaction to a really traumatic national experience. Why can't we do that now? We've had a difficult time recently, between COVID and a difficult political scene. It's my political version of it. And, actually I think the country needs change to a more optimistic environment. I think the last time I remember kind of the national sense of ambition to move forward was 2012 when we had the London Olympics. It was like, that felt a really exciting moment to be in. We'd gone through the financial crash. Actually, there was this moment of optimism and can do. And there was some wonderful kind of structures. We were doing all sorts of research into amazing school architecture. And where has that gone over this last decade? We've kind of lost a decade of national sort of investment and pride. And that's really sad to see. But I kind of get the feeling that, again, we will come back.
It's really interesting you say that, about this idea of national kind of optimism. Although it's not a building project, the last time I felt that was the World Cup in 2020.
Yeah.
The nation coming together, that kind of moment of us coming together. And you're right, the 2012 Olympics was another moment.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the World Cup was 2021, wasn't it? Because it was delayed.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah, it was delayed, yeah.
Yeah, I think, you do get these moments, but it's kind of actually how do we now manifest that in a kind of sensibility? And I think the reaction to Grenfell and the impact of the Building Safety Act and all of those things, as I said earlier, it's made practice really difficult. The framework in which we're practicing, the change in building regs, all of that has impacted on how we're delivering stuff. That coupled with a kind of really challenging economic environment, it's making for some really tedious buildings.
And you've got the whole policy of austerity and all this. So we're coming off the back of all of this stuff which has ground us down, and it feels like our reaction to it is not an optimistic one, it's a pessimistic one. It's with Grenfell obviously, it's how can we need more precaution, which of course is incredibly important, but the way it's kind of filtered throughout our design optimism, and it's kind of killed it to a certain degree. Not just Grenfell, but the general sense you get in the British architectural scene is one of incredible precaution and safety.
Yeah.
But like you say, with the 50s, I mean, we were in a very dire economic position, but one thing we had was optimism.
Yeah. And I think, we've just sewn things into a very dark place there, but actually and again, bringing it back to teaching and, churning out more architects. And I read a very bleak report the other day that said actually we're turning out too many architects, and that's part of the problem, and with wage suppression and so on and so forth. But actually, I would counter that. I think where I'm optimistic about the future is this generation. We've seen it in the school. I think this generation of architects, they don't challenge that we need to make better buildings. Better buildings means stuff that is more climate resilient. That's just hard boiled into our architectural expectation now. Whereas even with when I graduated, we knew we needed to do some sustainable architecture, but nobody really wanted to wear a hair shirt and nobody was interested in this bit of sheep's wool stuff. And, actually we should have been there were people who've been dealing with this for decades and not really being listened to. That to me is the sense of optimism, is actually we can now pretty quickly with this generation of architecture students graduating force change through in a much more focused and directive way. And it's not just good enough to kind of make buildings, it's how are those buildings responsible, how are we as a profession responsible. And I think that again brings us back to the dual program as being kind of at the pinnacle of this. It's sort of, we've got this research from COVID which says that everyone needs access to green space. I was reading an article this morning about how state schools have, the pupils at the state school have access to 32 square metres of green space in their school. In public school, that's 320 square metres per pupil. So we understand the importance of green space, and we're understanding also that if we keep selling off all of these green spaces in our cities, we're going to limit that access. We're going to make worse places to live. So actually, I think there is a countenance to it. And if you look at what's going on in the Netherlands, amazing stuff, these kind of green-blue resilient cities where actually they're seeing their urban spaces as part of the strategy to resist heavy rainfall and turn these spaces into this kind of green-blue infrastructure which benefits and makes our cities more climate resilient. The evidence is there that I think we're at this kind of turning point as to what our expectations are.
Absolutely.
I think that's kind of my positive take.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I also just want to add on to that actually, is that the work that I'm doing with Khizr Studio is trying to push that idea that architecture is something beautiful and the process is something beautiful and important to all of us and something we can all touch and access. And in trying to communicate what we do to the wider public, we get more people on board to join us in this cause. As we said earlier, the architect is part of a chain of entities which have interests, and finance teams seems to take kind of the most priority in that. So I think a combination, like you're saying, of students who have the idea of the climate emergency baked into what they do, but then also with something that Khizr Studio is a small part of, and hopefully there'll be much more of this, which I do see happening in the next few years. Storytelling playing a much bigger role in practice, and I think it will get to a point where it'll be rare to see a project without some form of storytelling attached, because we need to start communicating to lay people, the people who aren't within our industry, aren't in our bubble, aren't in our built environment bubble. If we can communicate to them, then and people know, people are generally, in my opinion, fairly intelligent. They understand the problems we face nationally, and we sit in a very important industry to try and create some, where change is needed, and we can drive that change. And I think in communicating what we do, it's almost as important, in my opinion, as producing the architects that do the change, because we can't do much without the backing of everyone else. And I think everyone else knows what's going on. There's a sense of what's going on. I think generally people get a sense that there's a lack of optimism. Generally people get a sense that we are heading towards a climate emergency. It's just about being the glue that brings all that together. That's how I see, we talked about this earlier, there's nothing wrong with ambition, but that's how I see the studio. That's the role I see the studio playing. That's the problem I see it solving, is being that interface between our industry and the everyday person. So I think, there's good motivations in the industry. There's people like you, people who have good intention, people are putting out good things, and hopefully it can compound into this kind of change that we want to see.
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
Amazing. I have not even been looking at the structure and the notes that I've got because we've just been going and it's been amazing. But I think we've covered a lot of things. I think we've covered most of the points I had, actually.
I think we have.
I think the only other thing that came to mind when you were talking was there's almost a difference between perception and reality. And this is something that I've kind of been realizing. I first realized it at uni when I saw the students who did nothing till the last day but spoke so well about their project that they got away with it. And I was like, wait a minute, I've done all this work, but perception in that instance was better than reality, or like had more influence than reality. And I wonder if in industry it's the same sort of thing. I mean, to give an example, there was a lot of conversation about, a lot of talk about how architectural renders sometimes try and give the perception, very rosy perception in the peak of summer when you've got great sunlight and everyone's outdoors, of what a space will look like. Well, we get a lot of rain in this country and we don't get too much sunshine, and we, not everyone's going out to the park on this one particular day, on this one particular hour. So it's an interesting point, because what I do now is I'm kind of engaged in the same conversation. How do you see that conversation of perception versus reality? And I suppose it comes down to the point of being truthful in what we're communicating.
Yeah, I mean, both teaching and practice, everything has to be based on truth, and I suppose, I think teaching-wise, I think most tutors can see through the emperor's new clothes. If somebody stands up and doesn't have the work but talks a good game, you're still going to challenge it. I would contest that anybody who's stood up and talked over nothing but talked a good game has ever done that well. And I think that's really interesting. I mean, again, I'll go back to my own experience and final presentation of third year, and the chap before me stood up and he plastered the wall with 100 drawings, and I was the person after him, and I sat there in absolute panic, and I had to step out of the room with our good friend Tim, and I said, Tim, what's my project about? Because I'd just gone completely blank. And I went back in and I pinned up my 12 sheets, and I had a really superb review. The person before me that had put up the 100 sheets, absolute really tough time. And it was that they might have done all this work, but they hadn't really thought about why they were doing something. And I think that kind of idea of, truth, perception, I think the why is the big question to it all. Why are we doing something? Why are we doing this? Why are we communicating? And I think to make a good narrative, to make a good story, you have to understand the why. And that is kind of very much how I come back to when I'm in a tutorial. I've been asking that question every time. It's, well, why are we looking at this? Why are we doing that? Why are we having this discussion about that moment when actually you haven't talked to me about that? And I think without that kind of detailed understanding of the why, you can't do anything else, So I think if you understand the why, then you can make your own judgment as to where the truth lies, and therefore it's not so much about subjective thought. I think that kind of leads you to clarify your perception of it.
Agreed. Fantastic. That's amazing. I think, what do you think? I think that's a good place to end it.
Yeah.
Unless there's any other points.
Fab conversation, mate.
That was great.
As you said, don't think we looked down once, but
no.
It's just been a pleasure.
Thank you, Howard, for coming.